Good morning. The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs will come to order. I'd like to start by welcoming our distinguished guests, Acting IG Shaw, Acting IG Ulam, and IG Zakel. Let me just welcome you all today, and we appreciate your time and your service. It's Zakel, excuse me. Thank you. Now, we're virtual, of course. We have to address a few housekeeping matters right now. For today's meeting, the chair of staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You'll notice a clock on your screen, and I hope everyone sees that, that will show you how much time is remaining. A 1-minute remaining notation means the clock will turn to yellow. That's when you have 1 minute left. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. And probably because we're virtual, I'll just mention how much time you have left. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. After the panel presents their testimony, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. So once again, thank you all for joining us for this hearing on the oversight of critical management issues at the Department of State, United States Agency for Global Media, U.S. Agency for International Development, and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. I am pleased to welcome State Department Acting Inspector General, Ms. Diana Shaw, USAID Acting Inspector General, Mr. Thomas Ulam, and a special welcome and congratulations to the new DFC Inspector General, Mr. Anthony Zakel. The offices of Inspector General play a fundamental role in providing independent oversight and equipping agency heads in Congress in their work to ensure the accountability and effectiveness of taxpayer dollars. This is especially true in fragile or conflict settings where the monitoring and evaluation of these programs are even more challenging. The independence and the nonpartisan nature of the offices of the Inspector Generals are absolutely critical to both their departments and the agencies of jurisdiction, but also to congressional oversight. Unfortunately, the prior administration and former Secretary of State did not respect that independence and intervened when they did not like the direction of a particular report or investigation. This has truly weakened accountability to the public. So as chairwoman of the subcommittee, it's my intention to support your offices and the indispensable role that all of you play in your oversight responsibilities. I also hope the Biden administration moves quickly to nominate qualified individuals to fill these important positions. The offices of the Inspector General issues annual reports identifying critical management issues where improvements need to be made and assess whether United States government investments in national security, economic growth, global health security, human rights, and governance continue to be efficient, effective, and in line with our foreign policy interests. Today's hearing is an opportunity to discuss the latest findings in these reports and other pressing matters. So as chairwoman of the subcommittee, I want to continue strengthening the integrity of these programs and the agencies that implement them while promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion so that people of color, women, and other minorities have opportunities in the foreign policy sphere. Secretary Blinken has publicly committed to increasing the diversity of the department's workforce as a priority. He has already taken some initial steps to do just that. In fact, on Monday, he announced the appointment of Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the Department of State. Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley has been a tireless leader and advocate for inclusion in U.S. foreign policy workforce, and as chair of the subcommittee, I will be looking for ways to support her efforts. So I encourage all of our IGs here today to hold the agencies accountable to achieve this very worthy goal so that our foreign affairs workforce reflects the diversity of America. And I understand the management challenges. They're always a work in progress. And I'm committed to working with all of your offices, as well as Secretary Blinken and the future USAID administrator and the future CEOs of USAGM and DFC to address these complex issues while making progress on our shared diplomatic and development goals around the world. So thanks all for being here, and I look forward to your testimonies. Let me now turn to my friend, our ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this oversight hearing with the Inspectors General. As you and I talked about this some time back, it gives the subcommittee a chance to talk to people who spend their waking hours, if you will, going over the details of each of these departments that we are hearing about today. I believe there's great value in hearing from these independent and objective representatives on challenges facing the agencies that we fund. This is especially important at the beginning of a new Congress, and even more critical at the start of a new administration, because it shines a light on the most important management issues that need to be addressed. Although the faces before us today are new, the chronic management challenges are not. Weaknesses in financial management, contract, grant oversight, risk mitigation, just to name a few, are problems that remain unsolved year after year. I hope the senior political leadership in all three agencies will take note of our discussion here today, because they will set the tone for how seriously the workforce takes the findings and recommendations of the Inspectors General. Most of these issues are not the flashy headline-grabbing topics of foreign policy, but they are key to successful operations and programs within our diplomatic and development agencies. However, when an IG report does make the news, it has the potential to cause irreparable harm in the court of public opinion. These days, public opinion of foreign aid is a mixed bag. With so many families facing economic hardship, it's understandable that there is great skepticism about sending aid overseas. We owe it to the individuals and every taxpayer to have strong oversight of the funds this subcommittee appropriates each year. We must hold the agencies accountable for accomplishing what they say they will, and in an efficient and transparent manner. This is even more urgent given the administration's request to increase funding for state and foreign operations by 12% in fiscal year 2022. Before I conclude, Madam Chair, I would like to thank these witnesses for their time this morning, but most importantly for their hard work when they're not here, and the hard work of their staff serving around the globe, leading the fight against waste, fraud, and abuse. We appreciate and value the objectives of these people and rigorous oversight on behalf of the American taxpayer. It's one of the most important contributions to this subcommittee. Again, I thank our distinguished chair for calling this hearing and bringing these important witnesses before all of us. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. How do you turn it on?
Madam Chairwoman, I think you're on mute.
To do that, excuse me. Let me thank our ranking member for his opening statement, and also just indicate that we will ask our witnesses to summarize their statements in less than 5 minutes. I want to be sure that we leave enough time to get our questions in, but I want to assure you that your full statements will be inserted into the record. After your testimony, I will be calling on members based on seniority of the members that were present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between majority and minority members. I will then recognize any remaining member in the order of their appearance. Each member is asked to keep their questions to within 5 minutes per round. We'll start now with Ms. Sharp. Please proceed, and thank you again for being here with us.
Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today regarding the work of the Office of Inspector General for the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for Global Media, also known as USAGM. As you noted, Chairwoman Lee, offices of Inspector General, like state OIG, play a vital role in promoting public faith in government by advancing transparency and accountability through their important oversight work. Because of our unique role and access rights, we are able to reach the often overlooked corners of government programs and operations, and where we discover issues, shine a disinfecting light. But OIGs do more than simply identify and report on such issues. Our root cause analyses and carefully designed practical recommendations arm the departments we oversee with the information and ideas needed to drive positive, lasting change. At a time when trust in government is at an historic low, the need for OIGs has never been greater. And it is for this reason that I'm especially honored to join you and my OIG colleagues today to talk about the important work State OIG has undertaken in the last year, which informs our assessment of the critical management challenges facing the department and USAGM. Despite grappling with the global pandemic that has grounded our teams and caused us to rethink the way we conduct oversight, our dedicated staff of inspectors, auditors, investigators, and evaluators, with the assistance of our wonderful mission support team, have continued to produce high-quality, high-impact reports on department and USAGM operations. I'm proud to say that in fiscal year 2020 alone, our work identified approximately $193 million in questioned costs and funds that could be put to better use, while our investigative activity led to an additional $3.7 million in monetary results and 20 suspensions and debarments. This represents more than a 2-to-1 return on investment based on OIG's current funding level. Our analysis of the issues identified in this body of work indicates that the department continues to face several critical management challenges, none of which will come as a surprise to this subcommittee. These challenges are addressed in detail in my written testimony, and I won't attempt to discuss them all, but I'll highlight 3 main categories here, what I'll call the 3 S's: security, stewardship, and staffing. Security. Safeguarding the department's people, facilities, property, and information continues to be a significant challenge for the department. While the department's efforts to promote security are commendable, our work continues to reveal significant deficiencies, including construction design flaws, residencies that don't meet department safety standards, and lack of emergency preparedness. Likewise, our oversight of the department's IT security program continues to reveal numerous control weaknesses, putting the department's IT systems at an increased risk of cyber attacks. Stewardship. Stewardship refers to the department's ability to efficiently and effectively manage its significant resources, including financial and property management, and contract, grant, and foreign assistance management and oversight. OIG's work demonstrates that the department could enhance its stewardship of taxpayer resources by improving its ability to identify and address weaknesses in its own internal controls. And finally, staffing. Our work reveals that many of the other critical challenges facing the department are caused or compounded by staffing gaps, frequent turnover in key positions, and inexperienced and/or undertrained staff. Moreover, instances of poor leadership, lack of coordination between and within department bureaus and offices, and conflicting lines of authority have at times undermined the department's effectiveness and impacted employee morale. Given the importance of the 3 S's, security, stewardship, and staffing, to the department's success, OIG continues to devote its precious, limited resources to performing oversight in these critical areas. However, our ability to support this foundational work and keep pace with new and emerging issues will require commensurate funding. OIG's budget has largely remained flat over the past 3 years, but with increases in our mandated work and rising IT costs, our ability to take on important discretionary work, including work in response to congressional requests, has been stretched to the limit. In closing, I'm incredibly proud of the work done by state OIG and the value we provide to the department, Congress, and the American taxpayer. And I'm grateful to Congress for the investments it has made and continues to make in us. I will work to ensure that that investment is efficiently and effectively employed as long as I am fortunate enough to serve with the talented and committed staff at state OIG, whether as the acting IG or deputy IG. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shaw. Now I would like to ask Mr. Ulam to proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, ranking member, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the management challenges facing U.S. foreign assistance and USAID in particular. I'm honored to appear before you today on behalf of USAID Office of Inspector General and its staff, who I have to say are among the most hardworking, dedicated, and talented oversight professionals I've ever known. USAID, along with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the African Development Foundation, and the Inter-American Foundation, which my office also oversees, manages nearly $30 billion in support of U.S. foreign assistance. OIG safeguards and strengthens these agencies' programs through timely, relevant, and impactful oversight, and we promote effectiveness, efficiency, and accountability, and identify instances of fraud, waste, and abuse. Each year, we report on USAID's top management challenges, which can limit the success of U.S. foreign assistance, foreign policy, and national security. In the wake of nearly 130 million confirmed cases and almost 3 million deaths, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these challenges. It has created economic disruptions, strained democratic institutions, and deepened humanitarian crises. While our oversight has helped position USAID to better respond to COVID-19, the pandemic's sheer scope, scale, and impact have stretched agency programs and operations. Today, I'm going to speak about USAID's 4 top management challenges, recognizing the effects of COVID-19 across our humanitarian and development assistance programs. Under our first management challenge, providing humanitarian assistance in crisis and conflict settings demands effective controls and to manage inherent risks, along with real-time visibility into those risks. After all, USAID can't mitigate risks that it doesn't know about. The billions of dollars that flow into these environments are vulnerable to fraud and theft, diversions of aid to the illicit market or armed groups, hurt beneficiaries, and can fuel further conflict. In response, USAID needs to continue to develop effective approaches for mitigating fraud risks, third-party monitoring, responding to exploitation and abuse, and ensuring implementer accountability. Under our second management challenge, the long-term success of U.S. development assistance depends on program results outliving the programs themselves. Yet, implementation of policies that call for planning and monitoring and rigorous risk assessments too often fall short, risking the sustainability of those development efforts. Reliance on local entities with underdeveloped financial systems, internal controls, and competencies can exacerbate this challenge. Our third management challenge deals with interagency coordination. Foreign assistance involves many U.S. agencies, international donors, local actors, including host country governments. Effective coordination and shared understandings of roles and responsibilities and priorities is absolutely critical in this context. USAID has had to adjust to policy developments outside of its control, and interagency constraints on budget and staffing have affected its ability to obligate funds and manage and oversee programs in the field. Programs run through public international organizations or other multilateral channels require oversight. USAID has adopted measures to improve PIO oversight, but further diligence is still required. Our fourth and final management challenge concerns agency core management functions. Effective financial, IT, award, and human capital management systems ensure accountability and effective use of taxpayer resources. USAID must ensure these systems are working well amid today's swiftly changing and challenging conditions. Across these areas, we provide relentless oversight, consistently delivering a financial return for every dollar while driving action at the root of problems affecting USAID's programs and operations. We will continue to maximize our impact by taking a strategic approach and leveraging key partnerships within the oversight community. In closing, I want to thank you for your support and the opportunity to speak today. We're grateful for that support of our oversight work, and I look forward to taking any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owen. Let me now ask Mr. Zakel for your testimony. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss perspectives on our oversight of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, also known as DFC. DFC is America's development bank, created by the BUILD Act of 2018. DFC's private sector tools provide a critical bridge between federal resources and dynamic private sector-driven development while promoting U.S. national security interests. DFC has outlined investments of over $25 billion in infrastructure, agriculture, and health, and aims to mobilize a total of $75 billion to reach more than 30 million people by the end of 2025. Through the passage of the BUILD Act, Congress also recognized the importance of strong oversight and created the DFC Office of Inspector General, or OIG, and I was appointed as its first Inspector General in August 2020. Since that time, I've set the course for oversight through careful coordination with Congress, DFC, USAID OIG, and others in the federal accountability community, and I look forward to building DFC OIG with the expertise, tools, resources, and support needed to accomplish our mission. My testimony today will focus on the mission and priorities of the newly created DFC OIG, the audit and investigative work we have completed and are planning for the future, and the top management challenges facing DFC. First, our main priority is to implement and follow the Inspectors General Act of 1978, also called the IG Act. Our mission is to conduct audits and investigations to improve the performance and integrity of DFC's operations and programs in providing foreign assistance to developing countries, either through direct loans and guarantees, equity investments, political risk insurance, feasibility studies, or technical assistance. Drawing inspiration from my experience at the Department of Transportation OIG, DFC OIG's core values are integrity, accountability, and respect, and these values will be demonstrated by our example and through our work and actions. Our goal is to ensure that we conduct our work in a thorough and professional manner in accordance with the rigorous standards of objectivity, independence, accuracy, and transparency upon which Congress and the American public have come to rely. Second, since I became Inspector General, we have been working on setting up the infrastructure to conduct oversight of DFC, and build an OIG that is responsive to the expectations of this committee, Congress, DFC, and its board of directors. This includes applying to the Office of Personnel Management for out-of-cycle allocations for 3 senior leaders in our office, working with the federal accountability community to have senior leaders detailed to DFC OIG in the interim, and creating solicitations to obtain contractor support for performing audit work. In addition, we developed the DFC OIG website with links to all of our products, DFC's open audit recommendations, whistleblower rights and protections, and most importantly, links to our OIG hotline. We have completed several products, including our first semi-annual report to Congress, a cooperation memo with DFC, top management challenges, and our OIG strategic plan. We also currently have 6 administrative and criminal investigations underway. This summer, we will start several audits, including those requested by this committee, and will audit DFC's progress in implementing the provisions of the BUILD Act. Third, from recent audits and investigations conducted by USAID OIG, we identified 4 top management challenges for DFC, which are critical in promoting the efficiency and effectiveness of DFC's operations and programs: managing risks, increasing partnerships to efficiently and effectively advance U.S. foreign policy and security objectives, improving performance management of project data as DFC's commitments grow, and DFC's organizational transition. DFC OIG's future audits and investigations will be aligned to address these challenges. It is an honor to serve as DFC's first Inspector General. I have been impressed by the commitment and professionalism of DFC, and I have a deep respect for its mission to support highly impactful projects in developing countries while advancing our nation's foreign policy. I look forward to working with all the members of the board, DFC, Congress, and this subcommittee while carrying out our independent and objective oversight work as legislated in the BUILD and IG Acts. Last, I would like to publicly thank Acting Inspector General Ullum and USAID OIG for its help and assistance while we work to make DFC OIG fully operational. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the start of DFC OIG. This concludes my prepared statement. I'll be happy to answer any questions members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you all for your testimony. And I'll start off now with my first question directed to Ms. Shaw. Now, a little over a year ago, your office released an audit of the performance of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, better known as PEPFAR, which is, of course, our largest foreign assistance program in the United States and has remained a bipartisan effort. The audit raised concerns about the country planning process, or this is called the Country Operational Plans, or COP. Am I correct? COP. Country
Yes, that's correct.
Plans, okay. Like many things, this process is complicated this year by the pandemic. But can you review the criticisms that you heard during the audit and the steps that the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator has taken to improve their COP21 process? And how can we be sure that the voices of civil society and host country stakeholders are included in any streamlined process? You know, the audit also raised concerns about the impact of PEPFAR's leadership, saying, and I'm quoting now from it, says department leadership and management principles were not effectively applied. Has this improved since the change in leadership? And what questions should we be posing to the new administration in terms of their pick for the next global AIDS ambassador to ensure the continued improvement?
Thank you so much for that question and for the close attention you paid to our audit work. We appreciate that very much. I'll start just by highlighting a couple of good news points regarding PEPFAR. Our work has found that the new PEPFAR Oversight and Accountability Response Team's work has been driving positive change. They've implemented some monitoring and evaluation activities that we find are promoting accountability in the program and the effective use of program resources through things like quarterly data calls to look at progress on particular points. We also completed work looking across 4 missions in East Africa that have a sizable portion of the PEPFAR program, and generally found that they were effective in coordinating among their interagency partners to reach consensus on country operating plans. But as you noted, there are some issues that we identified recently with respect to the country operating plan development process. And they fell into three buckets. First, the issue was with setting performance targets for each mission. The feedback that we heard on the ground was that although the process has embedded within it the opportunity for various stakeholders to provide input on those performance targets, over time, the sense that folks had who participated in that process was that there was not a true openness to that input. So while the input was solicited, it wasn't taken into account when performance targets were set. And ultimately, the Office of Global AIDS Coordinator were dictating targets that the missions deemed unreasonable given their input. Another issue had to do with the tool that's used to develop the COP, which people found very, very difficult to work with. Large spreadsheets with glitches and things like that. And again, sort of in the same vein, folks that we heard from said they were providing input, they were making suggestions for improvements, but they didn't see that input being taken into account. And lastly, with respect to the time frame in which these COP plans are developed, it's a very ambitious schedule. It's supposed to span approximately 3 months, but it's very labor intensive and time consuming. And what we heard on the ground was that because it is so ambitious, oftentimes it would stretch well beyond the 3-month period. And to your point about leadership and management principles, when we looked at sort of root cause for some of these issues, what we saw was a lack of collaboration, a lack of creating space for open and safe discussion, and the ability to share countervailing points of view, which don't align with the department's leadership and management principles. So we made some very helpful recommendations, and I'm glad to say we've seen some progress. So one of the recommendations that we made was that the Office of Global AIDS Coordinator create an action plan to ensure that various stakeholders are able to provide meaningful input. And so as part of the fiscal year 2020 guidance that went out, we saw that the program teams are allowed to propose targets for those performance indicators, which is a big improvement.
Thank you very much. And we'll have a second go round, hopefully. And I have some follow-up questions. So thank you again. I will yield now to our ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Washington Post has a motto that they print on the front page of the paper that says, "Democracy dies in darkness." And that explains why this subcommittee exists, as a matter of fact, and it certainly says the same thing about the inspectors general of the departments, shining the light in the dark corners of these agencies, at the same time illuminating the good works that is going on, perhaps, in a certain agency. So thus we have the flashlight in our hands on the subcommittee, but also on these inspectors general. 1 week ago, Secretary Blinken announced the U.S. would restore assistance to the Palestinians. This includes bilateral aid for the West Bank and Gaza through USAID, and funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, as they call it. The announcement comes shortly after the release of a GAO report with some specific recommendations for increased oversight of USAID programs in the West Bank and Gaza. Earlier this year, there were also troubling findings with UNRWA, education materials that glorified Palestinian militants and encouraged violence. This was acknowledged directly by the head of the UN agency, but is no less troubling. Acting Inspector General Shaw, what mechanisms does the State Department have to verify information it receives from UNRWA? And do you have any recommendations on how the department can tackle long-standing challenges with accountability and transparency with respect to UNRWA?
Thank you for that question. I think that what we've seen as a theme across our work is the need to balance the desire to provide the assistance with similar commitment to ensuring adequate oversight. Partly that has to do with ensuring that we are establishing well-defined and measurable performance indicators for some of that assistance, making sure that that assistance aligns with strategic policy objectives. And then, of course, ensuring that we're doing the sorts of monitoring and oversight activities necessary to make sure that what we're doing in these spaces is what we intend and having the intended effect. And so that is an issue that State OIG continues to look very closely at. And we've obviously made many recommendations, and it is part of our management challenge to ensure greater oversight and monitoring of the assistance that runs through the State Department. But we're also able to drill down a little bit into some of these areas. And so we have work ongoing and planned work to ensure that the department is exercising good internal controls, evaluation and monitoring activities. And part of that is really prioritizing that as a responsibility and then ensuring that those responsible for oversight within the department are held accountable for underperformance.
Well, we look forward to hearing from you from time to time about this issue. So keep us posted, if you will, please.
I will.
Inspector General Ullom, your office has had deep engagement with the USAID West Bank and Gaza program, much of which is directed in the annual SFOPS bill. I'm sure you're familiar with the recent GAO report. Do you have additional recommendations on oversight issues now that funding is set to resume? How can we make sure the funding is provided in a manner that's fully compliant with the restrictions in the State Foreign Operations Bill, the Taylor Force Act, and other relevant provisions of the law?
Thank you, Ranking Member Rogers. Fortunately, we have staff in Tel Aviv. I think it's important that we focus strongly on vetting of implementers in this area as the funding increases. Anti-terrorism vetting is important, and making sure that gets down to sub-award recipients. But I just want to affirm the fact that U.S. aid, U.S. foreign dollars can't fall into the hands of terrorist organizations. And I'm glad that we have staff on the ground with relationships that go directly to our top management challenge 3, talking about these interagency priorities and interagency coordinations, to have appropriate relationships to avoid redundancies in these areas as we try to monitor and mitigate risk in these areas. So I appreciate the opportunity to answer that.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I think my time has expired.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to yield to Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to each of our witnesses today for the testimony and for the good work you do. I want to address my first question to Ms. Shaw. In May of 2020, as you well know, President Trump removed the Inspector General of the State Department, Steve Linick, from office. That was not an uncontroversial move, and it was widely reported at the time that he was conducting several important investigations. I wonder what happened to those inquiries. That's my basic question. When Linick was let go, were all or some of the reviews he was working on completed by his successor or by yourself? Are any of these investigations still outstanding? And if so, are you able to share which ones?
Thank you for the question. I can tell you that of the projects or reviews that were ongoing at the time of former IG Linux departure from our agency, none of those jobs was stopped or delayed. We continued to work diligently on each of those projects, regardless of who was sitting in the acting IG seat. One of the projects we did release last summer, that was the report that we finished on the Saudi arms deal, the emergency declaration that was made to sell ammunition to Saudi Arabia. One of the other projects that was ongoing at that time had to do with representational travel by Secretary Pompeo's wife. That report was published in December. And we are in the very final stages and really nearly ready to publish the final piece in that group, which had to do with questions about use of government resources by Secretary Pompeo. And that, as I said, is nearly final in reporting and will be published soon.
So that third piece, the one on the Secretary's use of those funds, what is the likely time frame on that?
We're actually teed up to publish it this week.
All right, so that's very soon. All right, well, thank you. So that work did continue, and you yourself oversaw the work on the arms sale. Is that true?
I did.
And those findings are available to publicly available.
One portion of that report is publicly available. There is a classified annex that was not published, as you might expect, but it was made available to Congress in a redacted form through appropriate means.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ullom, let me turn to you and ask you again about the question of the frozen aid. The abruptly frozen aid. There was a series of reviews ordered by the Trump administration of foreign assistance to a number of countries, and then funding was frozen as that went forward. That applied to the West Bank and Gaza. It applied to the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, and applied to Syria. And then, of course, there was the effect of the pandemic on those aid programs as well. I wonder what lessons we've learned by virtue of these freezes and now the attempt to unfreeze some of these programs. But what were the impact of the abrupt cutoff of funds on program effectiveness, on erosion of capacity, on financial waste, on the morale of the people executing the programs? I'm asking you to generalize here. I'm also asking you what lessons we can learn and what conclusions you might want to put forward in terms of your work as to how these abrupt cutoffs of funds affected operations on the ground and what it takes to recover from that.
Thank you, Congressman Price, for that question. I mean, adaptability is key in the work that USAID does in performing in their foreign assistance mission. It's often that they have to be able to pivot, be agile to different administrations' priorities in that particular area. I think they've shown a propensity to be able to do that. There's always more to be done in that area. And again, I go back to the ideas of appropriate monitoring, appropriate risk mitigation. Planning in those areas is essential, but adaptability and pivoting their programming has to be at their forefront, and that goes to their interagency relationships to make sure that folks aren't being redundant in those areas, but are still trying to accomplish the same mission. And USAID in their development work, in coordination with states, diplomacy work, in the Department of Defense work. So thank you for that question.
Well, Madam Chairman, I know my time's expired, but let me just say I have some personal knowledge of one of those programs that involves educational work with autistic children with a school in Bethlehem. And I know the effect of the cutoff on that program, and I know how difficult the startup the restarting of that has been. I ask you that question because it's complicated many times over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Price. I'd like to yield now to Mr. Mario Diaz-Balart.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Can you hear me?
We've seen commodity prices rise to near record levels. This is in part due to large
Could someone mute, please? Thank you. Okay, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I have actually a couple of questions to Ms. Shaw. One of them is in the Inspector General's statement on the Department of State's major management and performance challenges for FY20. There was a brief mention made of conflicting lines of authority between the Western Hemisphere affairs and the special representative to Venezuela. So, obviously not all the relevant positions have been filled now in the new administration. But are you confident that these issues, or that this issue has been resolved? And if not, what can the current administration, again, within the Department of State, do to maintain a cohesive policy on Venezuela?
Thank you for the question. I would have to get back to you to find out whether our recommendations on that issue have been closed, which would indicate that the department has been fully compliant in implementing the recommendation. But I think that even if it hasn't been closed, we continue through a very rigorous compliance follow-up process to drive accountability by ensuring that our recommendations are taken into account. And then, of course, we always have the opportunity to go back in at some period later and do a compliance follow-up review, which is additional oversight to essentially measure the effectiveness of those recommendations. And so it's something that we will continue to look at and monitor and ensure that even when our recommendations are implemented, that they're having the intended effect. So we'll continue to keep an eye on that issue, certainly.
Well, I appreciate that. Let me stick into this hemisphere, if I may, Shaw, and regarding to in the testimony. Obviously, you couldn't hit everything, but I noticed that I didn't see in your testimony anything regarding the attacks, the sonic attacks against basically 24 U.S. personnel in Havana and their families. Some of those, by the way, as you know, have led to brain injuries. But those attacks also took place in some other places, I believe, in China. So, any comment on what we could be done to ensure the safety of U.S. personnel stationed in Havana, which is where most of those attacks took place, or in other places as well? How do we guard against that? Any comments? Any ideas?
Sure. Well, it's an issue that I know the department is looking at. And so our work would probably trail behind that slightly to evaluate what steps the department took, whether they followed a reasonable process to ensure the safety of staff. But security and safety is one of the primary issues that we look at for obvious reasons. Its importance can't be understated. And so we will continue to focus on those issues. And in particular, if we see an opportunity down the road, once the department has made some progress on this front, if there's work to be done on the oversight front, we will certainly follow behind.
And I appreciate that. I know the subcommittee, the chairwoman, we're all super concerned about that, making sure that our personnel are safe and wherever it may be. Madam Chairwoman, the ranking member actually already asked the other question that I had. And so in a very unique moment, I will actually yield back with a little bit of time left over. Thank you.
Let me yield now to Representative Frankel.
Hello, let me see if you can see me now. Okay, trying hard to adjust this. Okay, thank you to our guest today for being here and for your work. I think we know that the majority of that women make up the majority of poor people in this world, and it's pretty. I hope we all agree that when women have access to health care, to education, when they're safe, and access to financial resources, not only is their community safer and more prosperous, but the world is much more peaceful and more prosperous. And the pandemic has certainly caused a lot more hurt to families every place in our country and around the world. There was a very concerning report that came out of, and this question is for Mr. Ulam. There was a very concerning report that came out in regards to the Bipartisan Women's Entrepreneurship and Economic Empowerment Act. That's WE. Came out of our Foreign Affairs Committee. It was embraced by the Trump administration. So that was a rarity that we could actually be working together finally on something. But the report indicated that it had incomplete and inconsistent data about what was going on. And so my basic question is, is the flaw that you observed in the collection of the data, and what was the reason for that flaw, or is it in the actual program itself?
Congresswoman Frankel, thank you for asking that. So listen, I mean, I think you hit something that's critically important in any of these programs that any of our agencies operate in, and that's data quality, data integrity, and making sure that they're getting data in a timely and effective method. I mean, we have a planned audit that is going to focus on women and peace and security audit, women and peace and security. But I think that goes directly to our top management challenge number 2, where we talk about local capacity and making sure that we have appropriate sustainability efforts in place to plan and to measure and progress and evaluate these programs, right? If you fail to plan, we'll plan to fail. So planning in these areas is incredibly, incredibly important. And I'm glad you brought up the concept or the idea of data quality and data integrity. I think that's critically important in everything we do. There's so much data available to us, and to get that and to use it objectively and let the data speak to you, and let the data provide you with the information that the data is going to reveal, is going to help make any of these programs successful. And like I said, I'm looking forward to this planned audit we have on women and peace and security. But I appreciate you asking that question, and I hope that those ideas of planning and mitigating risk is going to be something that we can continue to improve on across the agency.
In regards to the implementation of the WE Act, though, was the report said that the data was incomplete and it was inconsistent. Was it due to the pandemic, or what? I mean, what was the cause of that?
Congresswoman, that was not our work. So I can't comment specifically on those particular findings, but that wasn't our product.
That wasn't your product.
Correct.
Is there? I'm so sorry. Is there someone else there who? Because it was from GAO, so not any of would not have been involved. Any of you?
Oh, so GAO does work across the U.S. government and in a variety of different agencies. So we deconflict with GAO to it's a force multiplier. It's a big government. There's a lot of programs to evaluate. So we deconflict with them. But nobody here today works or operates from GAO.
Okay.
But so I can't speak particularly on that audit.
Okay, well, I'll yield back. And Madam Chair, I'll have some other questions on the second round. Thank you.
Now let me yield to Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee. I appreciate it. So the Wuhan Institute of Virology is a lab run by the Chinese Communist Party, and it is also a potential origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the State Department, in the fall of 2019, several WIV researchers actually fell ill with COVID-19-like symptoms. And since 2017, we know that WIV has engaged in classified research with the Chinese military, the PLA. Additionally, this lab in Wuhan was the subject of 2 Department of State cables raising significant safety concerns. The Biden administration, scientists, the media, and now even the World Health Organization have called for a thorough investigation of this facility as a potential origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's also troubling that the U.S. taxpayers were funding this laboratory through federal grants made to EcoHealth Alliance, which is a New York-based nonprofit. In one instance in particular, EcoHealth provided upwards of $600,000 to WIV through a National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease grant. Unfortunately, this is not the only example of U.S. taxpayer funding going to WIV. In 2013, for example, EcoHealth Alliance was awarded $2.5 million in grants through USAID to study disease emergence. According to the House Foreign Affairs Committee Minority Report and published research, the EcoHealth Alliance used a portion of USAID grant funding to pay for WIV researchers to conduct gain-of-function research on bat-borne coronaviruses in China. It's worth noting that during the same time, the administration had a moratorium on gain-of-function research. So, Inspector Olam, to date, we still do not know the amount of USAID funding that was funneled to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. If the funding was approved for gain-of-function research, and if USAID knew the funding was going to a lab controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So with that, Mr. Olam, yes or no, is there an active investigation as to whether how much and to the extent of how much money USAID was being sent to the WIV?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. So we don't typically comment on investigations. So
Inspector Olam, I'm not asking you to comment. I just want to know if there is an investigation. It's very common for individuals like IGs, et cetera, to say if there is an investigation or not. So just a yes or no, is there an investigation or not?
Sure. Yeah. Really, I can't confirm or deny that. What I can tell you, though, Congressman, is when we have an actionable, credible allegation of fraud and wrongdoing, I assure you that our office will look into it. Again, I always go back to the issues of actionable and credible, and we have a staff.
Well, I mean, I just gave you that research, and this is research and documents that were done by the Obama administration. This is not something coming from a far right news source. This was the Obama administration and the World Health Organization, which clearly is not exactly United States friendly. But I'll just take what you said as a no, that we don't have an investigation. What would your office need to actually conduct an investigation, or at least an audit, to see how much money the U.S. taxpayers were sending the WIV to do this biological gain-of-function research?
So, Congressman, one, I'd be happy to talk outside the public forum on any of the investigative activities. But to your specific question regarding an investigation, I spent 25 years in federal law enforcement and rose up in the ranks of leadership. And what I always talk to the agents about is making sure that we have actionable, credible allegations of fraud, that we're able to track, have witnesses, have documents that we can look into to ascertain if a criminal violation occurred, if potentially there's a civil remedy in place, or if we can't deal with something from a criminal or civil remedy, to be able to refer something back to USAID.
Well, Inspector, are we at least putting policies in place to prevent U.S. tax dollars going to overseas laboratories that are controlled by adversaries such as the People's Liberation Army or other adversaries nationally? Do we have any guardrails in place?
So regarding policy, I can't speak specifically on policy, but from an oversight perspective, what I can tell you is the work that we do out of our office is solely designed to provide value and impact and to help USAID be a more effective administrator of foreign assistance funds.
I'd like to.
Well, I'm just going to yield back, Chairwoman. I'm out of time. Thank you for the allotted time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll have a second round. I'll yield now to Ms. Torres from California.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panelists this morning. The police and militaries in the Northern Triangle continue to act outside of their mandates, supporting authoritarian leaders and too frequently commit violence and human rights abuses. The State Department inspection of Embassy Guatemala City found that helicopters provided to the Guatemalan government for drug interdiction had been grounded since 2016 due to the government's poor maintenance and questionable procurement practices prevented them from meeting INL's airworthiness standards. The Guatemalan inspection also found that the INL section had not been engaging in proper end-use monitoring of defense articles provided to the Guatemalan government. And a few months after that audit was published, the Guatemalan government misused anti-narcotic military jeeps provided by the U.S. Department of Defense. We have seen police and military attack migrant populations. IG investigations consistently reveal insufficient oversight of security assistance and partnering with questionable actors. This is why I have zeroed out foreign military financing for Guatemala and Honduras for the last 2 years and El Salvador last year. However, despite these incidents, the U.S. government continues to provide funding to the police and military in the region through other funding mechanisms. The J8 Jeeps, for example, were used to intimidate CSIG and our own people in working at the U.S. Embassy at the time. So Inspector General Alam Shah, I have two questions for you. First, are there any funding streams or specific security sector programs related to the Northern Triangle region that your investigators have revealed to be particularly prone to abuse? And second, what recommendations can you make to ensure that our security assistance is not used against us or the people that it is meant to protect?
Congresswoman.
Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, I'll go. So what I'd like to talk about is something specifically related to our top management challenge of humanitarian assistance and stabilization, and then probably be able to, pivot over to some work that we have done in El Salvador. But in this area, especially when you have significant funding flowing in, making sure that risks and vulnerabilities are assessed prior to the funding is going to help drive positive systemic change. Especially in areas.
I'm sorry, that does not get to any of my questions. And if you need to follow up with me, I would rather you follow up than give me something that I know to be inconsistent.
Sure. Well, I can speak on a crime prevention audit that we did do in El Salvador that did illuminate some interagency issues down there, which I do think goes to your question.
I'm specifically asking about funding streams or specific security sector programs related to that region that your investigators have revealed to be particularly prone to abuse. And you can follow up with me, that's fine. I want to get to the problem here.
Sure, thank you, Congresswoman. We'll be happy to follow up with you if there's more
okay. I'll ask a different question regarding assistance to the Northern Triangle. I'm extremely concerned with any U.S. foreign assistance going to corrupt leaders in the Northern Triangle. It is our duty, as you stated, as elected officials, trying to effectively address the root drivers of migration, as well as appropriators who act as stewards of taxpayers' dollars, to ensure our money is going to the right people to do the right things. Congress has appropriated more than $3.6 billion for the initiative since 2016, making it the largest U.S. assistance initiative in the Western Hemisphere in recent years. So for the full panel, What was your degree of oversight over this and other previous Central America strategies? And have you investigated whether U.S. assistance has had its intended impact and reached the right beneficiaries given such endemic corruption in the region?
So I can start if that's all right with the rest of the panelists. So unfortunately, I can't cite to specific work that's been completed. We are continuing to work on issues in this area. And so I would just highlight some planned work that we have that I think will go to some of the issues that you've raised, Congresswoman. As you're very well aware, since 2010, INL has awarded the National Center for State Courts approximately $225 million in federal assistance for projects in the Western Hemisphere. And we've seen red flags. And so we are in the process of scoping work that would look at these awards. And they're specifically, the awards go specifically to projects promoting police training, counter narcotics, rule of law. And so it's going to be incredibly important that this assistance is used correctly, that they've set very clear policy objectives and performance indicators, and that there's good end use monitoring. So we will do audit work in this space. And I think, we hope to be able to provide some really informative information on this and would be happy to brief you and your staff when that work is complete.
My time expired. I'll yield back and ask.
Okay, we'll have a second round. Now let me yield to Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing. Unfortunately, it collides with my hearing as Ranking Member of Agriculture, so I haven't had the benefit of the discussion, even though I've had it on the side. I want to ask two questions, one about the Development Finance Corporation for Anthony Zako. How does the DFC budget scoring impact DFC ability to do its work? In other words, how are you going to score equity investments? Chair Lee and I have talked about this extensively because this is one of the possible impediments to fully leveraging this powerful diplomatic diplomacy tool or diplomatic development tool.
Thank you for the question, Representative. I would just, to be honest, that's, we realize the challenge, the major difficulty to date with equity investments is how they're scored for budget purposes, and they're treated the same way as grant assistance on a dollar-for-dollar basis. So
doesn't, let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
So doesn't that undermine the very intent of the law?
Absolutely. But again, this is not an OIG issue. This is really a policy issue for the new administration to try and address and rectify.
I understand, but you're here.
I am here. And what I can do is take that question for the record and see what the new administration is, if you will, proceeding and trying to address that issue. So that
well,
all
let's just, why don't we just leave it at that? Because obviously I knew you wouldn't be able to provide the answer, but you are the proxy at this moment for this deeper problem, and it will become your problem as you intend in the future, once this is resolved, to measure the outcomes of equity investments. So if you could do that, I'd appreciate it. In the interest of time, unless you have something profoundly impactful to the heart of the question, I'm going to move on to the next one.
Okay, no problem.
We're good? Okay, thank you. Madam Chairman, let me also follow up on what Norma Torres was asking. $3.6 billion to the Northern Triangle. And I've been supportive of this, but many of us recall the meeting we had about 2 years ago where this money went on hold. We weren't properly informed. Republicans and Democrats were both upset, but the heart of the matter that came out of that meeting of not being properly informed about the hold was, what are the metrics that we are using here to determine whether or not we are being successful? And the idea here is to get underneath the problems of corruption and crime and create economic space to decrease and mitigate migration pressures and to give people a chance where they are. So there's a whole host of beneficial outcomes here. What are the metrics that are being considered in the evaluation of these programs? Now, I should add as well that after that meeting, that hard meeting a couple of years ago, we submitted metrics to the State Department that they had begun to implement, but I'm not sure where those are.
If that was a question for me, I'll take that as a get back and try to get you the most up-to-date information on the status.
Yeah, I don't know, Ms. Shaw, again, I didn't have the benefit of the full hearing. So if you can do that, that would be very helpful, but it has to be very specific. Again, more money with a good intention is not necessarily the right outcome. This has to be standards of accountability, metrics that determine, are we making progress toward the outcomes we achieve? The outcomes that we want to achieve are good, they're reasonable, they meet multiple policy objectives, but I'm not sure the process is in place. I think that's what you're telling me. There isn't a process here for those metrics.
Well, I think our work has borne out that there has been some progress, but it's inconsistent. And so where we continue to see issues is in ensuring at the outset that there are well-defined and measurable indicators that are part of the assistance. And then, of course, the accountability and oversight once that money flows out the door. So that continues to be an issue. It is a work in progress, and we continue to do work in this area to try to provide some helpful recommendations.
So you are intimately involved in defining those parameters?
No, OIG does not play a role in defining. What we do is look at those definitions, both the process in terms of ensuring that they have well-defined criteria, but then that becomes the criteria in which we
So it's like
measure
a reverse, so a reverse engineering. So we've had, it's a reverse engineering is what you're saying. We're working back toward metrics because you can't measure the outcome. So you make the recommendation that gets implemented by the bureaucracy. So if we can expedite that process and get in front of this, because this has been going on a while and it's not clear that this is working properly. So my time's expired. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I would like to yield to Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member. Ms. Shaw, the office, and I've sensed that many of my colleagues have asked questions around this particular issue, but the Office of Inspector General has stated that the State Department has failed to consistently and adequately ensure that its foreign assistance programs achieve intended goals.
I think someone needs to mute. Mr. Fortenberry.
That's the first thing you evaluate. Okay, perfect. You missed this, maybe we come back to that, or no, that's complete, whatever. How about you, Tina?
I believe you need to mute, please.
You knew he wasn't going to answer, but you elevated the question for Lee and Rogers to hear.
But I did it politely. I know you can't provide an answer, but you're here.
Yeah.
Could someone ask Mr. Fortenberry to mute?
He's been muted, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Thank you again, Ms. Shaw. The Office of Inspector General has stated that the State Department has failed to consistently and adequately ensure that its foreign assistance programs achieved intended goals and objectives. This is consistent with my experience when I try to get from the GAO an evaluation and data regarding the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. They concluded that they couldn't compare across agencies and regions. They didn't have the ability to compare the data that this particular program, the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, had across agencies. And so this seems to be a general problem that some of my colleagues have addressed in different ways. Our ability to compare or to assess how successful a program that has been funded is. So what do you recommend that we do? I mean, this going to continue to give our money without being able to evaluate how successful these programs are, because we don't have the ability to measure the metrics. So.
Thank you for the question. And I think you've touched on sort of the crux of the issue for some of this. In order to be able to measure the success and to have good metrics, you need good data. And foreign assistance tracking has been an issue with the department, and one that it is very focused on, in part because our oversight work has focused on it. And so we have seen some improvement in the past year or so. The department has invested through their foreign assistance data review working group somewhere in the tune of $7 million to make improvements to their enterprise IT systems to better facilitate good data tracking on foreign assistance so that you can have a universe of data that would allow you to slice and dice the information and do some comparative work. We find that there's still work to be done, as you might expect. And part of it is ensuring that as they design a process to better marshal this information, that the folks who will be feeding in that data understand what the expectations are doing it consistently so that there is good data reliability that will then facilitate some of this data analytics work that you're referencing. So I think we're seeing some progress, but there's certainly more work to be done. And the foreign assistance tracking efforts are something we're closely monitoring.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Mr. Ullum, I'm concerned about the process in which projects are selected, particularly with China's incursion across the world and in this hemisphere. And so our ability to compete with China is saddled because, first of all, we really don't invest to the level they do, but they may do it in a predatory way. And secondly, because, I'm not really sure how we select projects and that those projects are consistent with our best interests in regions across the world, particularly in this hemisphere. As of December 2020, GAO issued a report indicating that an estimated $23 billion or 11% of the appropriated funds that USAID received from 2009 to 2019 remain not expended as of March of 2020. So not only am I concerned on how we select the projects to be competitive, but also money is laying around that we have not spent while China is just galloping and Russia galloping right across the region. What do we do to address this, Mr. Ullum? I mean, how do we select very appropriate projects that are important to communities across the region? And how do we spend the money that's just laying around while China continues to invest huge amounts of money in major capital projects across the region and winning the diplomatic war?
Congressman, thank you for asking that. So, I mean, what your question, it clearly shows the complicated global environment that USAID operates in. I know we have a planned clear choice audit. We've got, when you're dealing with China and Russia, countering malign Kremlin influence. We've looked at USAID's award management systems where we found that there was approximately 178 million that could have been used for other projects. To your question,
that's really peanuts in compared to what China and Russia are spending. It's no money at all. But I mean, even that, we're having issues spending. We got money laying around. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but if you can conclude.
Sure. Would you like to conclude, Mr. Ullum?
Congressman, we'd be happy to get with your staff and discuss that in a bit more detail outside this forum. Be happy to do that with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Madam Chair, you are muted.
Yeah, now to Congresswoman Wexton. Congresswoman Wexton.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you to the panelists for preparing before us today. Ms. Shaw, now in your testimony, you say that workforce management issues are pervasive in the State Department and that the contributing factors include things like staffing gaps, frequent turnover, poor leadership, and inexperienced or undertrained staff. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I represent a lot of State Department staff, and one of the things that was very concerning to me is the lack of morale, the diminution of morale and attrition at the State Department over the past term. And so I want to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the contributing factors? I know you cited those factors, but can you dig into that a little bit more and expand about what the specific impacts were and what caused them?
Sure. So where we see some residual effects, we did do work on the impact of the hiring freeze. And that did have a huge effect, particularly on the family members that are hired by the department to complete some pretty critical responsibilities, but also in the civil service group. And where we see impact is, a lot of these folks played important roles, particularly in the area, for instance, contract and grant oversight. And so where we don't have individuals in place to do that important work, then you start to see the corresponding impact. And we've talked a lot about those issues already today. We certainly saw some pockets of leadership issues as well. And I'm happy to say that we've got a report coming out very soon on leadership principles within the department that is a retrospective look at our leadership analysis across more than 50 inspections. And the hope there is to tease out some common areas of error on the part of leadership, but also some best practices, with the hope of arming new leaders as they come into the department with the information they would need to be successful. And so those are some of the issues that we've seen.
So you're saying that the hiring freeze impacted the ability of state to oversee the programs we already had, as well as deploy resources for the programs that we wanted to get out there?
It certainly had an impact, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you talk a little bit about what attrition and the loss of expertise at the State Department does to impact its mission and what you're seeing on the ground there?
So again, in the area of contract and grant oversight and foreign assistance oversight, that lack of expertise ends up resulting in contract officer representatives who don't have the technical skills needed to really oversee contractor performance and properly evaluate whether contracts are being executed along the terms and conditions of the agreements. And so that lack of technical expertise is a real issue that gets to the broader issue of ensuring that the money that is spent on this assistance is actually having the intended effect.
And I think that Secretary Blinken mentioned in his confirmation hearings that there are 1,000 fewer employees at the State Department than there were 4 years ago. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds about right. I think the number I had seen was around 850, but I don't know how recent that number was generated.
Thank you very much. Those are all my questions, Madam Chair. I'll yield back at this time.
Thank you.
Yielding back, let me ask now and yield to Ms. May for her question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all our guests for being here today. My questions are for Ms. Shaw. I've been following the gross mismanagement at USAGM since 2019. My concerns predate, actually, the rampant politicization of the former CEO, Michael Pack, and include corruption that had been exposed in a number of regional programs. The purpose of programs they oversee is to combat political propaganda in other countries and to be a source of true and trustworthy news for people around the world who don't have access to unbiased journalism. This is a program in which integrity is needed more than ever to protect the reputation of Voice of America from being considered yet another propaganda machine. The incoming acting CEO, Kelu Chao, will have to address ongoing suits on editorial interference, non-renewal of J-1 visas for journalists, misuse of $2 million in taxpayer money to pay a private law firm to investigate employees. This is not just a gross mismanagement of taxpayer funds, but a slap in the face to the mission of USAGM and the hard and often dangerous work of its reporters. I know that you have investigated some of these reports over the past year. Can you please summarize for us what your reports have shown, and more importantly, what policies the agency's new leadership can implement to rehabilitate the reputation of the agency?
Thank you. So some of the more recent issues are the subject of ongoing work, and that we expect will be published. But as you noted, we have done oversight work in this area, particularly since about the 2019 timeframe when some of these integrity issues came to light. And so I would point the committee to our recent inspection on compliance with journalistic standards, which was a major issue. Former CEO Lansing, when some of these issues came to light, had started the process of implementing some editorial oversight reform. And our inspectors went in to look at what those reforms were, whether they had been implemented, and what the effect was. And so what we found was positive to some extent. Of course, it's always more to be done, but some of the positive improvements, they were successful in translating the broadcasting standards and principles that you find in the International Broadcasting Act into journalistic standards and ethical behaviors that could be communicated, trained, monitored, and enforced. And all of the broadcasting entities had disciplinary processes in place for violations of the journalistic standards. We also saw an increase in editorial oversight, so consistent editorial daily reviews with at least 2 levels of review. We saw annual program reviews being conducted for the most part across the 5, but Cuba Broadcasting was a notable exception. And then, of course, content reviews. We also saw that they have brought in, or in the process of bringing in, a standards editor for each of their broadcasting entities, someone with some subject matter expertise. And then we saw, for the most part, with the exception of Cuba Broadcasting, really good tone at the top in terms of compliance with journalistic standards. So a couple of the notable exceptions, Cuba Broadcasting seems to be lagging a little bit behind. They, for instance, have not updated their journalistic standards since, I think it was 1991, and it's not well publicized either to external audiences or to its own employees. And employees were very unfamiliar with the editorial oversight reforms that other entities had put in place and the timeline. So there's definitely room for improvement there, but we're seeing some good progress.
I know I don't have much time left, but I just wanted to ask about the new position, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Department of State, and how might that position effectively contribute to the State Department's work. And I do want to acknowledge our Chairwoman Lee's efforts and leadership on this issue. Our first hearing this year was focused on diversity of our Foreign Service members, and also progress that the State Department has made in developing joint guidance to coordinate efforts regarding amongst relevant bureaus and offices regarding investigation and disciplinary review of sexual harassment cases.
Madam Chairwoman, shall I respond?
Quickly, because we're going to have a second round, and I'm going to ask each member who has a second question to limit our question and time frame and responses to 3 minutes. So quickly, Ms. Shaw. Yeah.
Sure. I would just say I think it's a positive improvement that they've designated a single person to give the kind of sustained attention to the issue that is needed. Certainly too soon to tell what the impact will be, but it's something we'll be looking closely at as that person settles into the role.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. Second round, limit to 3 minutes. Ms. Shaw, I'll follow up with regard to the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, which has been investigated recently for violating editorial standards by airing an unfounded and blatantly anti-Semitic video segment. It's my understanding the conclusion was that the video, radio, and web content of Radio Television Marti fell far short of journalistic standards, noting that the well-established norms of objectivity in journalism are routinely discarded, something that I've had long concerns about with respect to OCB. So would you describe in more detail within this 3-minute segment OIG's concerns and whether you have received documentation that the reforms, mind you, that your office recommended have been actually implemented?
Thank you for the follow-up question. So as you noted, the issues we saw were with non-adherence to journalistic standards, issues with appropriate sourcing, with attribution. And so we have seen some improvement in terms of the editorial reforms that have been put in place. We did make some follow-on recommendations. We are waiting for a compliance response from USAGM, and I believe it's overdue. And so we are following up with them to determine where they are in that process. But it seems to be moving along well. What I will say is that, as you know, USAGM has experienced quite a bit of upheaval over the last few months. And so one of the things that OIG is interested in looking at is how these editorial reforms are carrying forward despite the changes in leadership. And so we have an inspection planned to look, I believe it was actually in response to a congressional request, to look at USAGM's compliance with 22 CFR 531, which codifies a lot of the journalistic standard principles. And so we will be doing that work and look forward to reporting on those findings.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to that report also. So be sure we and the committee gets a copy of it.
I will.
Thank you. Now I'd like to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me follow up with Mr. Fortenberry's questions about the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, created in 2018 and directed to combine elements of USAID with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, into a single organization. Quite significant for any number of reasons. Let me ask Mr. Zackel some questions about the DFC. It's been intended to help counter China's worldwide effort to what they call the Belt and Road Initiative. China's growing influence in developing countries, especially, and authorized by the BUILD Act of 2018 for 7 years through 2025. But there's a built-in contradiction in in the DFC's efforts. There's a tension there. Like its predecessor, OPIC, there is the expectation that the DFC will create some positive returns for us economically, returns on investments, interest earnings, and the like. Mm-hmm. And yet the DFC is also at the same time charged with prioritizing support for less developed countries, poor countries, if you will, which conflicts in a number of ways with that other effort. What do you think? Is that tension that's built into the new DFC, is that valid, and what do we do about it?
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member Rogers. My answer would be, I think that's a natural tension. Well, as you mentioned, the BUILD Act, was very bipartisan because, number one, there was a need to, if you will, mitigate Chinese and to a lesser extent Russian influence in the developing world. And as you mentioned, the BUILD Act doesn't require it, but for decades, OPIC had a record of generating earnings for the U.S. Treasury. But the BUILD Act specifically states that in general, DFC shall prioritize the provision of support to less developed countries with low to middle income economies. And that's why the word development is in our title. And so it's no longer about generating returns, but rather investing in development. And that's why the expectations for DFC have changed accordingly from OPIC. And so that's why we emphasize in our top management challenges that DFC is challenged to manage risks while balancing revenues against operating costs. And so there's going to be a higher risk because we're going to be going to developing countries and, if you will, investing in those lower to middle income economies. But we will be auditing DFC in the near future on its progress in implementing the provisions of the BUILD Act. And while DFC noted in its 2020 annual report that 66% of its projects went to low to middle income countries, we'll assess that as part of our audit, as well as if trends point to increasing assistance to developing countries as mandated by the BUILD Act.
Well, there are some legislative proposals to double DFC's exposure cap from 60 billion to 120 billion. And on top of that is the worldwide pandemic that we're dealing with, affecting every country's economy. There's substantial funding in this bill, and likely to increase even, for economies that even were weak before the pandemic hit. So do you have the personnel that you anticipate you'll need to look after this greatly expanded role and amount of money?
Well, thank you for the question. And I'll answer this very quickly with a sly joke, which is right now I am the only employee for the Office of Inspector General at the EFC. And I pointed out in my opening statement that I really appreciate the assistance from USAID OIG, but we currently are bringing folks on board, and we'll have 9 FTEs by the end of this fiscal year. But yes, if the role, if you will, and scope of the work is going to double, as some reports indicate, then yes, if you will, our oversight role will have to grow as well.
Well, we wish you good luck.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Price. Can you unmute, please? Mr. Price, can staff unmute Mr. Price? Thank you.
All right, sorry about that. Yes, thank you. With 3 minutes remaining, I want to return to Mr. Ullum and give him a chance to give him a chance to elaborate somewhat more fully on the challenge of dealing with these stop and start situations with respect to aid. We on this subcommittee learned the hard way in the last Congress how hard it was, how limited our tools were to deal with a summary and we thought unconstitutional cutoff of aid to the West Bank and Gaza, and also to the Triangle countries in Central America. Duly appropriated aid that was summarily cut off, and we had many reports, as I said, of the dislocations that required, and how the challenge was going to be to get these things up and running again. There's some legal challenges, as the ranking member made clear earlier, but I understand those are being addressed. But I wonder, Mr. Ullum, what you'd say about that, just in terms of the agency's ability to get things moving again. It's very important that this happen in these next weeks, months. You know, these programs have been on hold now for a couple of years.
Thank you, Congressman Price. So we have a couple pieces of work, and I think that might be able to illuminate this issue a bit more. But just like when we're talking about Afghanistan, so USAID had to implement cuts. You know, this goes back and forth where we talk about mitigating risk in these programs, and when you're starting and stopping programs or changing priorities in programs, and Afghanistan's a good example of that. USAID had to cut staff at the direction of State Department, but you know, then there's questions of sustainability. So when we're changing these priorities, it does affect USAID's ability to operate in these environments. In Iraq, we had work in a past quarterly reporting in Iraq where we talked about bringing down USAID staff levels, but then funding began to increase in that area. So that has a counterproductive response and could cause issues in making sure that programming is doing what it's intended to be doing. So we hope through our work we can illuminate some of those issues to better prepare USAID to be responsive and to be able to pre-position or pre-plan to be able to respond to exactly what you're talking about, is changing in administration priorities. And I think USAID has shown a propensity to make some progress in that area, but I do think that that's still a challenge area.
Well, it's certainly right this minute right this minute in West Bank and Gaza. So we'll look forward to learning from you going forward as to how to mitigate these impacts. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Let me follow up on the OCB conversation that took place a little while ago. So the purpose of OCB, and I know everybody is aware of it, is to break through the information blockade by the Cuban regime to its people. You know, we all remember that the Cuban regime is a murderous, totalitarian, terrorist regime. That's the purpose of it. And so it's interesting because one of the issues that existed with the U.S. AGM leadership was complaining that the journalistic standards that they were trying to impose required reporters to ask the regime for response to stories and for confirmation of facts, which is patently absurd, ridiculous. I don't think anybody would disagree that asking the regime for certain facts of reports has nothing to do with journalistic standards. Has that changed? Or is that, I mean, I know it changed in the last administration, but is there still this request to, as part of journalistic standards, to require journalists to get confirmation from the regime, or has that changed?
So my understanding is that it's not as prescriptive as that. From what I understand,
it was before, and that was one of the issues that the journalists would always complain about. That U.S. AGM under the previous leadership was demanding those sort of things. And by the way, they had to do it, and you saw that in their reporting that they would actually link to the regime's stories, which is patently absurd and frankly highly irresponsible. So I just want to make sure that we clarify, because it sounds good, and not that they don't have issues, by the way, but it sounds good to say, well, you know, we're insisting on journalistic standards, but let's be very clear. What during the Obama administration and even after for a while after that, that's what they were insisting on. They were insisting on that journalists actually go to the regime for the other side of the story and also for confirmation of facts. So I just want to make sure that that everybody's aware of that.
Thank you. And I was familiar that was part of former CEO Lansing's approach to editorial oversight. Where I see it being less prescriptive now in terms of how this has been translated and codified within the standards at US AGM and by extension the broadcasting entities, is that there's a focus on variety of sources. There's a focus on obtaining a balance of information, but it's not as prescriptive as going directly to the regime and asking for input. And so I think it provides sufficient latitude for the reporters to use good judgment. And then, of course, there's a much stronger oversight process in place to ensure that information is being vetted and that it is balanced within reason. But I do recall seeing that one of the things that is not required is providing the countervailing point of view when it's not supported by good facts. And so I think that's the effort to strike at the balance that you're talking about.
All right, and I appreciate that, Madam Chairwoman. I know my time has expired. I just want to make sure that because a lot of things were said that we understand what we're talking about. You know, you're not talking about balance when you're asking the regime. Again, the whole reason for OCB is because of the regime. Balance is not asking a terrorist state for their version of the story. And so I just want to make sure we're all clear about that. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You've been very kind and patient. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me yield now to Ms. Frankel.
Okay, hello. Well, I'll try to ask a question. I hope some that you can answer this time. And I think this is for Ms. Shaw. I was concerned to see that the Office of Inspector General's fiscal year 2020 report found the State Department poorly coordinates investigative and disciplinary processes when cases of sexual harassment are reported. Can you give me some insight into that and whether or not there's been any improvement?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So that was a very important evaluation looking across the department. And what we found is that the department had two different entities that had some responsibility in this arena. And the coordination between those entities was deficient in some respects. And so we were able to make some good recommendations to better define roles and responsibilities first and foremost, to help facilitate better communication and coordination, and then followed by stronger processes to ensure that these reports are moving through the process, being routed to the right entities to look at them, and being followed through. One of the other important recommendations we made, which the department has concurred with and implemented, is when reports of sexual harassment and misconduct are received, they have special investigators who've been trained to deal with witnesses and victims of sexual harassment and misconduct to better facilitate the process for doing that fact development in a way that understands the unique circumstances of someone in that position. So I think our recommendations have landed well with the department, and we continue to monitor them as part of our compliance follow-up.
Was there a lot of harassment found, and was this overseas as well as with going on overseas with workers, or here domestically?
I would have to get back to you with the precise statistics that came out of our survey. I can tell you that it was not an insubstantial number of people who indicated that they had either been the subject of, a victim of, or witnessed sexual harassment. What was also concerning that came out of that survey data is that it is, as you might expect, highly underreported. And so we had far greater people expressing having been part of, either as a witness or a victim, sexual harassment, but not having reported it for some fairly concerning reasons, to include that they didn't think it would be taken seriously or that it could jeopardize their career. So definitely some serious issues there.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Now I would like to yield to Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the Biden administration recently renewed assistance to the West Bank and Gaza, but failed to secure concessions from the Palestinian Authority, and also failed to get concessions and reforms from the UN Relief and Works Agency. This decision ultimately undermines the security of both the United States and our ally, Israel. The Palestinian Authority spends millions of dollars annually to fund terrorists, leaving it up to the international community to fund humanitarian assistance for the Palestinian people. Taxpayer-funded foreign assistance for Palestinian people must be conditioned on changes by the Palestinian Authority, including ending the financial support of this disgusting program known as Pay to Slay. Inspector General Olem, the GAO recently found significant gaps in terrorism vetting, and specifically gaps in vetting procedures for U.S. aid subcontractors working in the West Bank and Gaza. Yes or no? Has your office investigated whether U.S. aid programs in the West Bank and Gaza are compliant with congressionally mandated restrictions on aid to the Palestinians?
Congressman, thank you for asking that. I'm not familiar with the details in that GAO report that you just described, but I do want to comment on the vetting, the anti-terrorist vetting, to make sure that does get down to the sub-award level, to try to minimize, to make sure that terrorist organizations aren't benefiting from U.S. dollars, U.S. foreign aid. So our office does work closely with DOJ, and if those allegations of fraud come in, like I commented before, we do have staff in Tel Aviv, but using our tools of criminal, civil, and an administrative remedy, suspension and debarment is a powerful tool when money goes to the wrong entity, an entity not it's entitled to go to or intended to go to. But suspension and debarment is a key tool that USAID has.
Right. Well, IG, yeah. So IG, given the resumption of U.S. aid to programs to the Palestinians, will your office actually conduct oversight to ensure that these funds are spent in full accordance with the law? Or do you need, or as you said, you're waiting on an actionable to do that? Because I would think that with the Palestinian Authority track record on funding terrorism, your office would already be on top of this.
Sure. So that's the criminal side. We do conduct non-federal audits, and every dollar that goes into the West Bank Gaza is reviewed. So that falls into some of the mandatory work that our office does. And so, yes, we will continue to review funding that goes into that area.
Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Now I will yield to Ms. Torres from California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The BUILD Act included my amendment, which requires the DFC to develop policies and procedures for assessing whether foreign entities have in place sufficient enhanced due diligence policies and practices to prevent money laundering and corruption. Inspector General Zackel, I heard your answer to this issue that you are one employee currently. So I just want to encourage you to look into these policies and ensure that they are in place as you begin to build your staff. Thank you. And unless you have anything to add to my previous questions, I would otherwise yield back.
I would just answer or respond that we're aware from previous USAID OIG audits as well as GAO audits that there have been key witnesses in OPIC's internal controls and a lack of attention to process, as well as in 2017, individuals were able to defraud OPIC of more than $1 million by making fraudulent representations, including false financial documents inflating the value of assets. So we're aware, if you will, of the past history, and we intend to take that into account when we conduct our audits and investigations going forward.
Yeah, I'm more concerned. Well, I'm very concerned about the Northern Triangle, and in the case of Honduras, we have the now deceased sister of current President Hernandez, saying that it's very easy to create NGOs, to use to launder USAID, back to these corrupt actors. So eyes wide open going into this. We want to make sure that we are holding all of these entities accountable for how they use hardworking taxpayers' dollars. Thank you. And I look forward to hearing back from all of you on my previous questions, and we'll send them in a written form to you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Portenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me follow up on Ms. Torres' excellent observation. And Madam Chair, it's my understanding that you are contemplating a hearing on the Northern Triangle issue shortly. And if that's the case, if I could make a suggestion, perhaps we could write a letter to State Department teeing up these questions before that hearing. In other words, what are the metrics for success here? I think we've all been trying to get to the bottom of this, and obviously it's a little bit unfair to put the Inspector Generals in the middle of that question, since they are responding to the metrics that we've laid down. But since they aren't laid down with clarity, I think that this would be a key component that if we gave them enough heads up, there could be a more substantive address of that. So I ask you to consider that. From my perspective, it'd be a good idea. Secondly, I have a letter here, if I could ask for submission to the record. It's regarding the DFC. I wrote it to our National Security Advisor, Mr. Jake Sullivan. And the point of continuing to bring up the Development Finance Corporation, whether you want to look at this through the lens of a rethinking of our development diplomacy, humanitarian relief, attacking the structures of poverty, using the best aspects of the market system, or whether you want to align that with stabilization and national security policy. The objective is all of the above. So I've written this to Jake Sullivan. If I could include that in the record, Madam Chair, I'd appreciate it.
Please do.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, I want to talk about Middle East Partnership for Peace, MEPA. Our former chair, Loie, and I had worked on this issue. She was gracious enough and clearly with intentionality got this into law last year as part of our appropriations bill. So it is underway. I'd like to hear the Inspector General's comment on how they may be starting a review process of the beginnings of the implementation of Mepa.
I'd have to take that question for the record, Representative, since we're not involved with policy, and we frankly haven't started even conducting any audits yet on internal control. So we will, if you will, add that to the list, but we will look forward to addressing that question of yours.
Well, it's important because obviously it is in formation, it's in its seminal stages. So again, I think what we're struggling with here, if you can indulge me for a moment, Mr. Zako, because as policymakers, we get limited shots, that's not the right word, efforts to engage various administration personnel. And you oftentimes become a proxy for a lot of other issues. However, when there aren't standards for evaluation properly built in, then you're hamstrung with the ability to provide us answers like we're asking for in the Northern Triangle. Does this work or not? What is the measure for success? We've got a lot of complexities, a lot of variables. I suspect the same may be true for MEPA, and so that going in early so that you can use your judgment and skills to actually help shape the parameters of evaluation is what I was talking about earlier regarding reverse engineering on the Northern Triangle dynamic.
We have done proactive audits in the past, and that's essentially what you're requesting, and we can discuss that with your office now that I see we're beyond time, but that's something we are interested in essentially in doing and making.
Yeah, an audit doesn't have to be a pejorative term. It actually helps us understand what we are achieving. So thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Porter. Let me clarify. I believe we're having a briefing on the Northern Triangle, but I think your request in terms of the questions in advance make a lot of sense, whether it's a briefing or a hearing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me thank all of our witnesses and members for your time and testimony today. Also, if members have questions that they would like to submit for the record, please submit them to the subcommittee within the next 7 days. And again, thank you to our witnesses. You see, your jobs are so important to not only the agencies, but also to the public and to ensure the proper expenditure of taxpayer dollars. You see the interest of our members, and we really appreciate your being with us today and look forward to working with you. Thank you again. So the hearing is concluded if no one else has anything else they'd like to say. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.